Pastor, theologian, scholar, and regular Good Catholic contributor, Father Jeffrey Kirby, joins Good Catholic's Rachel Shrader on the Truth Be Bold podcast, a fearless, down-to-earth weekly discussion on the topics at the forefront of our Catholic life today.
Greetings, friends. Welcome to the podcast, Truth Be Bold. I'm Father Jeffrey Kirby.
And I am Rachel Shrader.
And we talk about issues that are facing real Catholics in the trenches, in the day-to-day struggle to follow the Lord Jesus, to be faithful to the gospel. And of course, all the topics that we're addressing, again, are real issues. And we thought for this fifth episode that we'd go ahead and begin to address some of the end-of-life questions, which are very much out there, which are very pressing, that affect most Catholic families. So figure we'd just start there, Rachel, and kind of maybe talk a little bit about end of life, and then specifically I want to address the question of artificial nutrition hydration. That tends to be the battle zone. So I think maybe the best way to start is for us to remind ourselves that even in the dying process, we belong to the Lord. So St. Paul says, whether we are we're alive or whether we are dying, we are the Lord's. So we can't say, well, I get to the end of my life, I get to the dying process, and I can pause my discipleship, right? So moral truth doesn't apply. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I want to be in charge, and so on. No. The same discipleship that has guided our entire life has to also guide the dying process. And with the dying process, we know that there are demands of discipleship. Sometimes there's difficulty. Sometimes things could be easier or more comfortable. Again, that's our whole life, right? But we choose to follow the way of the Lord Jesus, which always includes the cross, because we're dying to ourselves in order to follow moral truth, in order to follow Him. So with that, if we look at the dying process itself, there are multiple questions. In fact, we can say some of the more pressing questions pertain to pain management, or questions about medical power of attorney and advanced directives. But the most pressing issue that always comes up pastorally and in my work as a moral theologian is artificial nutrition hydration. And in large part because, as Catholics, we make this distinction between ordinary and extraordinary care. And this is very important as we speak about end of life. Because when we're talking about ordinary care, it means it's morally binding. Extraordinary care is morally optional. Now, how do we know whether something's ordinary or extraordinary? And this is where it can get confusing if we don't have clarity, because something can be morally binding for one person, morally optional for another. Oof. Yes. And so there are various criteria that the Church uses in order to help us discern whether something's morally binding or morally optional. For example, one's vocation in life. So if someone is bound to the care of another, parents of children, adult children of their elderly parents, and so on, then the stakes are higher. We can look at the capacity for pain. How do we receive pain? Some people, pain is more acute than other people. We can look at the results or the side effects of proposed treatment, or the ratio or percentage of success. So for example, if there's a surgery and they say we have a 30% chance, well, that's different than if they say you have a 90% chance, right? So there are a lot of factors medically, morally, vocationally that the Church asks us to consider. By the way, I love this. The Church says if someone is in an irregular marriage, or if they are in the state of sin, everything is morally obligatory until they reconcile with God.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
I did not
Isn't
know
that powerful? The Church would say salvation is first. So if you're not right with God, you fight for everything you can in order to continue your life until you reconcile with God. So there's even the spiritual and the moral that's a part of this. So various criteria come into play in which the believer discerns, and of course is guided by moral truth, guided by the Church. Is this ordinary or extraordinary care? Okay, now we use these terms, and as I'm describing this, you can see that these are very holistic. Now, here's the problem. The medical community uses the same terms, but they use them very differently. They use them in a more narrow tone, a more narrow way. So, for example, they could say, well, artificial nutrition hydration is extraordinary care. That's it. No matter the state of affairs, no matter the patient, it doesn't matter. That's extraordinary care. The difficulty in our country is that through the lobbying of various medical groups and hospice groups, the law supports this in terms of what is extraordinary and ordinary care. So we have a legal tradition now that can be difficult. We have a medical community that is trained one way with the same language that we use as Catholics. So sometimes when a nurse is speaking to us, a hospice nurse or a doctor, and they say, well, yeah, this is extraordinary care. We just have to be aware as Catholics that we approach that term in a far more holistic way. And so they're using it in a different way than what we are. So just because they say it's extraordinary care does not mean it's extraordinary care for us. Whew. All right. So far, so good. All right. So if we understand that, then the question becomes, well, one would think, well, artificial nutrition hydration, this is when someone is no longer able to feed themselves or to naturally digest food or water. Well, someone would think, well, obviously that's extraordinary care, right? I mean, that seems obvious. Well, hospice groups would agree with you, and the law in the United States would agree with you, but the Catholic Church has some questions, right? So, for example, if our bodies are still able to digest food, so we're still able to receive, to appropriate food, then we still have to give food to a person, even if it's artificially administered. And this sometimes catches people off guard. Like, wait a minute. So you're saying even if it's artificially administered, it still has to be given. Yes, if their body can still receive and digest food and water, yes, we still have to give people food and water.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's feeding through a feeding tube is a very common thing. Like,
exactly.
It's technically artificial. Yeah.
Yes. And the technology now is far more advanced, where it's not as cumbersome as it may have been even 10 years ago.
Right.
And that point I just want to stress, because if the body can receive food and water, we have to give it to a person. And as obvious as this might sound, we cannot starve someone to death, right?
It's sad that you have to make that statement these days, but you have to.
Right. And exactly, because the medical community can be very convincing and, overwhelm a family. Well, they're not able, they're dying, and they're not, it's time for us just to let go. And, we can suspend nutrition, hydration, and they'll be on pain meds, so it'll be okay, and so on, And again, a family can be overwhelmed emotionally because their loved one's dying, and they trust their doctors and nurses, and they say, oh, okay, all right. But again, as Catholics, we have to pause and say, wait a minute, can they still receive food and water? Well, yes, but they're dying anyway. Well, think about it like this. If an adult person who's dying were to soil themselves, and we were to say, well, we're not going to change their adult diaper because, they're dying anyway, right? Or we were to say, we're not going to change their sheets or their bedding because, well, they're dying anyway, right? That would be cruel, barbaric, right? And it's the same principle as, well, they're dying anyway, so we might as well just starve them to death, right? So no, if their bodies can receive food and water, they still have to be given this, even if they are actively dying. Right. The rule of thumb can be, what's going to take their life? The illness or the suffering that was pre-existent, or the suspension of the food and water, even if it's artificially administered. And this is the battleground. I mean, when we talk about end of life, this is the battleground. Everything else, pain management, questions about medical power of attorneys, there are battles there, right? Questions of informed consent, really big issue. But when we talk about end of life, this is the battleground, artificial nutrition, hydration. I think just these distinctions between ordinary, extraordinary, okay, good, that the ordinary is binding, that nutrition, hydration, even if artificially given, is not automatically extraordinary. And we're using same words but different definitions, Catholic Church, medical community, and for the Catholic family in that situation to know what questions to ask. Woo. And that's some of the background we can give for artificial nutrition, hydration.
Right, and it's nice to know, actually, as we talk about this, that it's actually a very easy distinction. Like the distinction that you just made between what's going to take the person's life. I mean, that's a fairly, I'm not saying it's an easy question to answer medically, but it's a very easy line to observe. It's just like, well, what's going to take their life? It's a pretty simple question. And so you don't actually have to get into anything really that complicated in order to reach a morally valid conclusion to this.
Yes, and in fact, just knowing that language, that could be a question to the hospice nurse or to the medical doctor. If I stop nutrition, hydration, what will take their life, right? And oftentimes they'll get very uncomfortable with that question,
Yes.
right?
Well, they're going to starve or,
right,
right. dehydrate to death. So.
And you're cutting through all the intended or unintentional confusion and going right to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
What will take the life of my loved one?
Exactly.
So, what do you think?
It's amazing. I love what you said about the fact that the dying process, we belong to God even in the dying process. And I'm always reminded in conversations about this, about the fact that in the beginning, God created man and gave him stewardship over the animals, right? And he gave the man the power to kill animals if necessary, whether for food or even to put them out of their misery. We do that all the time, right? We say we have to euthanize an animal because we are stewards of an animal's life. And we can say, obviously there's times when it's cruel to kill an animal, but there's also times where it's cruel not to, because, they're suffering, they're dying. We are the stewards of that life, and God has delegated that power to us to decide when is a good time for their life to end. He did not give that power to us over other human beings. And yes, there are certain situations, just wars, self-defense, things like that, where taking lives is necessary, but that's kind of a different situation. We're not the stewards of each other's lives in the same way that we are the stewards of animal life. And so we have to understand that we are the Lord's, as Father Kirby's amazing book on this very subject is called, We Are the Lord's, and that, he owns the dying process as well. God, it's always God who is in charge of giving and taking of human life. And we can't arrogate that process to ourselves for any reason. Like I say, outside of things like just war or self-defense, we can't arrogate that power to ourselves in situations even where it almost seems logical to do so, where somebody's really suffering, where it seems like, care is not doing any good, when it seems like it's almost like this brutal logic that, it seems like you would euthanize a person that's suffering like you would an animal. It's like, no, that is not your choice to make. We are the Lord's, and he will take life when he chooses to. And if he decides to extend a person's life, extend their suffering even, or if he allows their suffering to continue, he has a reason for that. It might be for the good of their soul. It might be for the good of our souls. And so at the end of the day, we're not stewards of other human lives in the same way we are of animal life. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
I think it's a great point, Rachel. And we can include that includes even our own lives.
Exactly.
And that shakes the contemporary person. Wait a minute, I'm not even the Lord of my own life.
Yeah.
I don't have stewardship over my own life as we have stewardship over the animals, as you were describing. And yes, that includes our life. Our life is not our own, right? And we know that as Christians. I mean, the Lord's clear on that. So for a Christian, that's not even a question. Right? But even a person of goodwill, they know their life is not their own, right? A husband knows that in terms of a relationship with his wife. Parents know that in relation to their children. People know that in terms of the relationship with their extended family, their community, their neighborhood, their church, and so on. So we are constantly in interaction with other people, and we are constantly being asked to do things, expected to do things, told to do things that are beyond us, that we are in the midst of a vast network of relationships. And to think somehow in the midst of this, well, I'm a sovereign self, I belong simply to myself, is delusional. It's like, no one lives in that way. No human being. And so, of course, as Christians, we broaden that. We, of course, understand this relationship we have with God even more so. And then, of course, it even elevates our other relationships in this world. But I think the word sometimes that people struggle with is questions of autonomy. So autonomy, it means, if we just look at the word itself, it just means self-will. And we can say more broadly, it's this type of self-possession, and it could be summarized in expressions such as, I want to decide what's going to happen to me. It's my life. Popular jargon today, it's my body, and so on, right? So this is radical autonomy. Now, that's just so insulting to our human nature and to our human dignity, because the reason why God allows us to have autonomy is so that we have something to give. Right? So if I don't have myself, how can I give myself in service to another? So as Pope St. John Paul II would say, our self-possession always leads to self-donation. So I have myself, not for myself, but I have myself again, so I have something to give. And so to cut out the giving part, that self-donation, and say, no, I am my own self. I am the sovereign self. I will do whatever I want, and I will die however I want, and I will not do this, and I will not do that. Well, we've heard this language before in the story of salvation, most preeminently in Lucifer. So in the evil one, I will not serve. I will not do what God has commanded. I will not obey, and so on. And the dying process can be difficult. I always think of the wise virgins, preparing and using that oil, waiting for the bridegroom, is if we live a life of virtue and we seek to be good disciples throughout our lives, we will have the virtue, the foundation, the help that we need at the end of life. If we've been lackadaisical and not been attentive, then the dying process will be more difficult. It doesn't have to be.
Right.
But there are going to be hard decisions, difficult moments, perhaps great suffering for some in the dying process, and we can prepare for that now. I think it's great during Lent. I mean, we literally begin Lent with putting ashes on people's foreheads and saying, "You are dust, O man, and unto dust you shall return." You can't say, "I didn't know."
What? I have to die at the end of this?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're literally being told at least once a year to get ready for your death, right? And to be ready, because it can be turbulent, but it doesn't have to be.
Right.
As turbulent.
And we have the examples of the saints. Like, how many saints, don't answer this question because it's too many, like some more than we could ever count, died really difficult deaths. Long, slow illnesses. One of my favorite saints, St. Gabriel Possenti, is one of those many 19th century saints who died of tuberculosis in his 20s. Like, it's an awful disease to die from, but yet they died like saints. Yes. Like, and they embraced their suffering and they died like saints, and they knew that they were not in charge of when God called them, and that they had to suffer or not, as long as the Lord decided.
And so can we. That's all the opportunities of grace that the Holy Ones received, we also receive.
Yep.
And so as we talk about the dying process, which includes all these questions, including artificial nutrition, hydration, we cannot forget our discipleship. We cannot forget the dying process belongs to the Lord. And we can't forget that we have received all the resources, all the graces we need in order to have a holy death, in order to say yes to whatever the Lord might ask of us, to say yes, whatever God's providence will permit, to say yes, and to allow ourselves not simply to die, but to die in the Lord, to die a holy death.
Right, and to embrace the sufferings of our death as a way of expiating our own sins, like the deficiencies in our life. God gives us this, might sound a little crazy, but suffering is a gift. And even in suffering at the end of life especially, because it gives us an opportunity to really offer our lives to God, to make up for those deficiencies, and really gives us kind of that last chance to really make a great sacrifice for God.
Yes. And I think it's only crazy to those who either don't believe or have not yet deepened in their own discipleship. Of course, I think of our previous episode, we talked about redemptive suffering. We went through this, that, as Christians, how we approach suffering, and that includes the dying process. So,
can I ask a fun question as we wrap up?
Oh, please.
Have you seen the movie The Last of the Mohicans?
Yes, gosh, that's going back a while.
Yes, it's not the 90s, literally. So there's this end of life actually comes up in that movie. So this does not happen in the book. I love the book, and it's vastly different from the movie. So this doesn't happen in the book. But in the movie, I don't know if you remember, the character of Duncan gives his life in exchange, basically, for somebody else. And so he ends up having to die a terrible, horrible, torturous death at the hands of the Hurons. And his friend Hawkeye is watching from a distance as this happens, and he watches him get kind of strung up, and he's burning to death. It's like he's in horrible pain. It's terrible. He's obviously going to die. And so Hawkeye, he's famous. He's called Hawkeye because he can shoot, a tin can off a tree branch at 400 yards with his long rifle. And so he decides to do what seems like a noble and a charitable thing. He shoots Duncan through the heart to end his suffering. Was that a morally permissible act?
Yes. So I would say in that case, that as difficult as it can be, even when there's immense suffering, we cannot take life. And I think that goes back to the previous point of we don't have stewardship over human life as we have over animal life. I think of Our Lady at the feet of Calvary, as she saw our Lord, her Son, brutally treated and suffering a torturous death. And that's where, as Christians, St. Paul calls it the mystery of evil, right? That we step back and, Lord, I believe. Like, we recognize His providence rules all things.
Exactly.
As, Lord, grant me faith. Like, I love the prayer from the Scriptures. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Because even St. Paul describes the mystery of evil can be confusing, can be overwhelming. But we replace that confusion with faith. Lord, I believe.
Exactly.
And hopefully that will mark the dying process. And in those difficult questions that families will face, such as artificial nutrition, hydration, I pray that faith triumphs over fear, and that confusion is cast away by clarity and moral truth. So
that's right.
But,
and once again, if you would like to know more about these issues, we recommend Father Kirby's book on this very subject, We Are the Lord's. We carry it right here at the Catholic Company. So there it is.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank
See you
you
next time.